All right, well, good morning. Here we are again, Breakfast with the Bible, Psalm 114. This one has 8 verses. Even with 8 verses, I find that the Psalms are still quite deep, even with the short reading that we're going to have. So I'll go ahead and get into it. It says, when Israel went out of Egypt, the house of Jacob from a people of strange language. Judah was his sanctuary and Israel his dominion. The sea saw it and fled, Jordan was driven back. The mountains skipped like rams, and the little hills like lambs. What ailed thee, O thou sea, that thou fleddest, thou Jordan, that thou wast driven back? Ye mountains, that ye skipped, like rams, and ye little hills like lambs. Tremble, thou earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob, which turned the rock into a standing water, the flint into a fountain of waters. So, right, 8 verses, not long at all, but there is some deep truths in this particular passage. After 113 Psalms, we have definitely learned and heard a great deal of the exodus of God's people out of Egypt. It's a reoccurring story. We're told throughout the Psalms that it's important to remember, to teach the children, to carry on that legacy of what God has done. But the reason for this is much bigger than just that exodus out of Egypt. This is much bigger than we tend to realize. You see, the rescue of the Israelites out of captivity and oppression is the central act of redemption under the Old Testament. It is the epicenter of the spiritual encounter that exists for us in the New Testament, as New Testament believers. The rescue that is available to us because of Christ is envisioned in the physical experience of the Israelites. There are unfathomable amounts of connected moments in what we read of the escape from Egypt to what we have in God through Christ. The comparisons are important because, and this is why we're told so many times to remember what God has done in the shadow of things to come, because this is a pre-image of a spiritual aspect that we have available to us today, and even from the New Testament on. That being said, Psalm 114 is a picture of that exodus. Psalm after psalm calls us to remember this miracle, to teach it perpetually to the generations, one after the other. And it is just as true for us who are rescued by the work of Christ. We must proclaim it continually, teaching it to our children and our children's children. What is presented in verse 1, when Israel went out of Egypt, the house of Jacob from a people of strange language, is the notion that Israel did not belong in Egypt. They were among a people of a language that they didn't speak. This is implied by the reference, again, to strange language, to unknown language, to foreign language. Now, what is presented in verse 1 is this sense that they don't belong there. They are of a different place. And again, that implication on the physical expression here in the Old Testament is the same in the spiritual in the New Testament. And for us, is that we don't belong here in this earthly plane. We have a home that is above. And that is spoken quite a bit throughout the New Testament. Now, while living there 400 years, it was never became their home. Now, if you are a child of God, you are a stranger in a strange land, and you and I are currently residing in a place of a strange language. Just look around. To me, the language is getting stranger and stranger. Now, there is a language that we can understand as God's people that others do not. It is that language of the gospel. It is that language that is so foreign to others. It is foolishness to those who are perishing, is what Scripture says. Now in verse 2, Judah was his sanctuary and Israel his dominion. The tribe of Judah represented the entire nation of God's people, the place where God's presence dwelt. This is signified by the term of sanctuary. Now God's people recognize that his true dwelling place was among his people, not in temples made by hands. There is something significant weaved into these first two verses. Now, while being foreigners in a land of aggression and opposition, the truth of God's presence can never be diminished or eliminated. Even in today, there is nothing anybody can do to reduce the presence of God, remove the presence of God, even affect the power of God in any way whatsoever. God will do whatever he desires to do, whenever he desires to do it, for whatever reason he desires to have, and you and I and nobody else anywhere can do anything about it. That is our God. God dwells among his people no matter where they may be and how difficult the circumstances. Judah was his sanctuary, the picture of where his presence dwelt, and Israel his dominion. He had dominion over everything. Now, let this be a note to all who oppose. You cannot take the presence of God away from those who serve him. You just can't do it. It will not matter what you do. Where God's presence dwells, he has dominion. And God is present everywhere. So, ipso facto, he has dominion over everything, and there's nothing we can do about it. In verse 3, the sea saw it and fled, Jordan was driven back. We see the psalmist painting a picture of nature itself responding to the Lord. Now, nature doesn't have a choice. Nature is obligated to respond to the power of God. This verse, speaks both of the beginnings and the endings of the Israelites' journey. Nature is always and forever will be in complete submission to the power and glory of God. Nature cannot push against anything God commands or decrees. No man can control it. No man has the power over it that isn't already prescribed by the Lord. Man tends to think in his pride that he can determine its cause or course, or even change what it's going to do. But if it is God who nature must obey. Now, God may allow us to affect it in certain ways, but it's only by his permission that anything is even done. Morgan said, nature recognized his presence and obeyed his will. The sea fled, Jordan was driven back, mountains and little hills were moved. Again, nature has no choice but to respond to the power of God. If God says this needs to do that, there is nothing else it can do that will happen. The Red Sea saw the presence of God and so appropriately responded. The earth quaked and shook at God's presence as God's power. If the presence of God can cause nature to react unnaturally, if you will, how ought we, who claim to be intelligent, respond to his presence? If nature itself can do something it's not in our perspective designed to do, then how are we to respond? The scene the psalmist is implying is not simply the exodus from Egypt, but the entrance into the land of promise. This is for us to consider both our redemption as well as our soon home in his presence. In verses 6 and 7, because we spoke of 4 and 5, the sea, the water, everything, the earth was just submitted to the will of God. But in 6 and 7 it says, ye mountains that you skipped like rams and the little hills like lambs. There's this rhetorical question almost. Tremble, thou earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob. The psalmist directs a question to nature itself. Clearly, again, rhetorical. Both because nature cannot answer and that the psalmist already knows why. Nature has no capacity to oppose God's decree. It is powerless to stand against its creator. The same is actually true against you and I. We do not have power to stand against him. In our pride, we think maybe we have a little bit, but there isn't. How often, again, do we think that at one point or another we may have power over God's will? Well, I want to do this. The only thing that you can do is whatever God permits. Now, there's it gets kind of a little webby in that particular statement because you're saying, well, God permits bad things to happen. Well, yeah, actually he does. You remember the book of Job, story of Job. God permitted Satan to do up into this limit to affect Job's life. It doesn't mean that God approves to the point to where he's delighted in it, but he allows affliction, he allows the enemy to have an impact. Now why? Why would he do that? Because we're taught in the New Testament that his desire for his children is to become more and more into the image of Jesus. To do that, we must be forged. We must be forged in fire. We must be forged in pressure. And God's desire for us is to respond, to learn, to grow in those difficult situations. What Satan doesn't realize is that the limits that he has in the abilities to affect our lives is really only inside of God's realm of design to help us mature and grow better. Now, sometimes we don't. But if we understand this truth ahead of time, we can go, well, I realize this situation may come from someplace else. But God can take that situation, cause me to see it through his eyes, and then work something out in me that makes me stronger. That's important to remember. Scripture clearly teaches that we have absolutely no power or authority to move God away from what he intends to accomplish. 7 and 8, Tremble, thou earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob, which turned the rock into a standing water, the flint into a fountain of waters. The psalmist called upon the earth to fear the Lord. Now, obviously, that has already been accomplished because of of nature's response. But what else could it do? God has authority over all of creation. It must obey. God can demand creation to do whatever he pleases for whatever reason he has. He not only causes nature to respond according to its design, but he can also cause it to operate against it, bringing water from a rock, for example. Something that is clearly not designed to produce anything is now producing water. So may we never think in the slightest degree that we have any more power to stand against God than nature itself. Nature has to obey God even to the point of doing something it's not designed to do. The Red Sea splitting in half, creating walls on both sides, and the ground being dry. Nature doesn't operate that way. But the God of nature can operate any way he pleases, creating situations and scenarios and circumstances that don't make sense to anybody, simply for his glory and our good. I hope that concept, that idea, that vision, that perspective kind of caused you to think a little bit and encourage you to look for situations that God can use, whether it be a pleasant situation or a very difficult situation, both of which, if you're a child of God, is designed or at least worked out so you can benefit from it. This is great encouragement. This is great comfort. So there is Psalm 114, a whopping 8 verses. nature has to respond to God. Why don't we? That's an answer that we all have to come up with on our own. So, as always, thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, share, do those things you do, and we'll catch you in Psalm 115. Thank you, and God bless.